So if you were to pull out your smartphone right this very second, and you go into the system settings and just, change the entire operating language to Japanese or maybe Swedish.
Oh, your brain would instantly go into a state of like mild panic.
Totally. Just complete panic. Because suddenly everything you do hundreds of times a day on autopilot. I mean, texting, checking the weather, setting a simple alarm.
It all becomes an active puzzle.
Yeah, exactly. It feels deeply uncomfortable. But according to cognitive science, inducing that mild panic might actually be one of the greatest, most underutilized mechanisms for achieving rapid fluency in anything new.
Right, because it forces you out of what neuroscientists call the default mode network. You can no longer just coast. You are actively forcing your brain to map new linguistic symbols onto deeply familiar physical actions.
And that concept, that idea of deliberately breaking the autopilot, is at the absolute center of today's deep dive. We're looking at mastering language acquisition and, frankly, just dismantling this whole idea that learning has to be this grueling, miserable slog through giant textbooks.
Which is such a relief, honestly.
I know, right? So the source material we're working from today is a really specific excerpt. It's titled #3Script, How to Learn English Well. And it comes from a larger work called The Fluent Habit, Mastering English Through Daily Practice.
And it's a really interesting text because, well, on the surface, it doesn't present itself as this dense piece of cognitive science.
No, not at all.
It's just written as a simple scene in a coffee shop.
Right. It basically reads like a play.
Mm.
We have these two characters. There's Leo, who is this highly experienced, effortlessly fluent language learner. And sitting right across from him is Jethro, who is a highly motivated but currently very, very frustrated student.
Yeah, he's quite literally sighing over a massive vocabulary textbook.
Exactly. And our mission today is to extract Leo's blueprint for fluency. It's about uncovering the daily habits that transform learning from, a tedious chore into a natural, engaging part of everyday life.
Because the advice Leo gives Jethro throughout this coffee shop conversation, it sounds almost incredibly basic at first glance.
Right.
He tells him, practice every day, watch movies, don't be afraid of making mistakes. But if we actually look beneath the surface at the neuroplasticity required to adopt a second language, we realize Leo is actually describing a highly optimized cognitive framework.
Yeah, and we want to break down the mechanics of that framework today because Jethro represents where most of us start. He looks at Leo and asks the classic question, what is your secret?
Everyone wants the secret.
They want the hack. And Leo tells him flat out, there is no secret, just consistency. Doing a little bit every single day instead of cramming once a week.
Which is not what Jethro wants to hear.
No. Jethro pushes back immediately. He complains that daily practice sounds awful because memorizing word lists from a textbook just makes him bored. And Leo, surprisingly, completely agrees. He says memorizing lists is the worst way to learn.
It really is.
Okay, let's unpack this. Because trying to learn a language once a week by staring at a giant list of 50 vocabulary words, it's kind of like trying to eat an entire week's worth of food in one sitting on a Sunday.
Oh, that's a great way to put it.
Right. It just makes you sick. You can't digest it. You absolutely need small daily meals to actually process the nutrients. But my question is, if we all fundamentally know that, just like Jethro knows that staring at that list is boring and rarely works, why do we always default to these painful methods?
Well, what's fascinating here is that we are all basically victims of the industrial model of education.
The industrial model.
Yeah. Traditional schooling isn't necessarily designed for optimal long-term retention. It's really designed around the logistical constraints of, standardized testing, weekly quizzes, grading periods. So that structure inherently forces a cramming behavior. You aren't learning a language to integrate it into your natural speech.
Right.
You are learning it to cross a specific hurdle on a specific Friday at 9 a.m.
So you just load up your short-term memory, dump it onto the test, and then promptly forget the whole thing by Monday.
Exactly. It's like treating information like a software update that you try to forcefully install all at once, which, usually just crashes the system.
Yeah, your brain just blue screens.
Pretty much. In cognitive psychology, there's this concept known as the Ebbinghaus forgetting curve. It illustrates exactly how rapidly we lose memory of learned information if we don't actively attempt to retain it.
So when Jethro tries to cram that massive list on a Sunday,
by Wednesday, his brain has actively pruned the majority of those synaptic connections. Because the brain is incredibly efficient. It looks at that massive dump of isolated, out-of-context words and decides, well, this isn't relevant to our daily survival, let's just dump it.
Wow. Okay, so Leo's anti-secret. His whole approach of ditching the textbook for daily consistency, he's essentially trying to trick the brain into believing this new language is vital for survival.
Precisely. By choosing lightweight, daily integration over heavy, weekly cramming, you are leveraging spaced repetition.
Right.
When the brain encounters a word on Monday, and then again on Tuesday, and again on Thursday, it sends a very clear signal to the hippocampus. It says, hey, this information keeps recurring in our environment. It must be important. So it actually begins the process of consolidating it into long-term memory.
Which perfectly brings us back to that mild panic of changing your smartphone settings.
Yeah.
Because that is the very first tangible habit Leo suggests to Jetro.
Yeah.
If you throw out the boring word lists, you have to replace them with environmental immersion.
And our phones are the ultimate environmental immersion tool. We look at them, what, 100 times a day?
Easily. And I love this because it's kind of like rearranging the furniture in your house. Well, if you move your couch to the other side of the living room, for the first few days you walk into the room and your brain has to suddenly wake up and pay attention to the environment, right? You can't just stumble through in the dark.
Oh, yeah, you'll trip right over it.
Exactly. Changing phone language forces that same kind of hyper-awareness. But let's look at the mechanics of why that works for language. Because just looking at a foreign word on a screen doesn't magically make you fluent.
No, it has to be tied to action.
Right. So if my alarm app is now in Spanish and I want to hit snooze, I have to bridge the gap between the physical action I desperately want to take and this new vocabulary word on the screen.
It creates a forced yet incredibly low-friction context. Think about it. You already know intuitively where the snooze button is. The spatial geography of the app is perfectly mapped in your brain.
Oh yeah, I can hit snooze with my eyes closed.
Right. So when the text suddenly says something unfamiliar, your brain doesn't have to work hard to understand the concept of snoozing. It only has to map the new linguistic label onto a concept you already know intimately.
You're just swapping out the label. You aren't building this concept from scratch.
Exactly.
Okay, so that makes a lot of sense. But Leo goes further into media immersion, and this is where I actually got a bit hung up on his advice.
Oh, what part?
Well, he tells Jetro to watch English movies and YouTube channels with English subtitles. Read and listen at the same time. That makes sense. But then he says when he hits a word he doesn't know, he pauses the video, writes the word in a small notebook, looks up the meaning, and then tries to use it in a sentence later.
Okay, yeah. Active consumption.
But wait, I have actually tried a version of this. I tried watching a French film once and pausing to look up words. Let me tell you, I lasted maybe 15 minutes before I hated the movie. I hated French.
Yeah.
And I wanted to throw my notebook out the window.
That's a very common reaction.
It completely shattered the pacing of the story. So how is turning a fun movie night into a start and stop homework assignment any better than the boring textbook Jetro is sighing over? Doesn't that completely ruin the fun?
Your frustration is completely valid. And honestly, if you are pausing the movie every 10 seconds to look up a word, you are definitely doing it wrong.
Okay, good. I felt like I was going crazy.
The nuance here, and the reason Leo's method actually works when applied correctly, comes down to emotional resonance. Leo tells Jetro something really important. He says, learning words in a real story helps your brain remember them much better.
Right, a real story versus a sterile list.
Whoa.
But I'm still caught on the disruption. The disruption ruins the story.
Well, it depends on which words you choose to pause for.
What do you mean?
If you pause for every single preposition or obscure adjective that you don't know, yes, it's tedious and it ruins the pacing. But what usually happens in this kind of active immersion is that a specific unknown word keeps appearing in the dialogue over and over, or a word is spoken during a highly emotionally charged climax. You pause then. Because at that moment, you aren't just learning a dictionary definition in a vacuum. You are anchoring that new vocabulary to a character's facial expression, or a dramatic plot twist, or, a joke that just landed perfectly.
Oh, wow. So you are tying the data directly to an emotion.
Yes, exactly. The amygdala, which processes emotion in the brain, works directly with the hippocampus to encode memories. So when an event is emotionally charged, the amygdala basically signals the hippocampus to store that memory much more deeply.
That makes so much sense.
We are biologically wired for narrative. So when you finally pause and look up that word from the movie climax, it sticks. You aren't trying to recall page 42 of a boring textbook. You're recalling the scene where the hero yells that specific word right before jumping out of a helicopter.
Okay, I see. So it's not about documenting every unknown word. It's about selectively leveraging the narrative structure to build these sticky memories.
Exactly. Let the story do the heavy lifting for your memory.
And he also mentions using that word later to make his own sentence, which I guess bridges the gap between passive consumption and active production.
Which is the hardest part.
It really is. And that leap is essentially the terrifying hurdle Jetro is facing right now. Because consuming media, even if you are pausing it, is safe, right? You are just sitting alone in your living room. But the conversation naturally shifts to Jetro's biggest obstacle, which is actual output, speaking. Jetro confesses to Leo, "I am always afraid of making mistakes when I talk."
Yeah, this is the wall almost every single learner hits. The fear barrier.
And Leo's response is, well, it's very gentle. He just tells him, don't be afraid of mistakes. Mistakes are just part of learning. But here's where it gets really interesting to me. The physical progression Leo used to get over this fear.
It's quite unique.
Yeah. He didn't just jump into a crowded room and start talking to strangers. He tells Jetro he started by practicing completely alone in his room. He would stand in front of a mirror and literally just describe his daily routine out loud to his own reflection. Now, I have to ask you about this, because on the surface, talking to yourself in the mirror about how you're, like, pouring your morning coffee, does that actually work as a stepping stone, or does it just feel incredibly silly?
Oh, it definitely feels absurd at first.
Right. I'd feel crazy.
But if we connect this to the bigger picture neurologically, it is an incredibly sophisticated stepping stone. To understand why it's so brilliant, we have to look at what Jetro's fear actually is. When he says he is afraid of making mistakes, he isn't afraid of the linguistic error itself.
Okay, then what is he afraid of?
He is afraid of the social judgment that follows the error.
Right. Looking foolish in front of a native speaker. The scraped knees of learning to ride the language bike.
Exactly. You can't learn to ride a bike without scraping your knees, but social anxiety triggers a very real, very intense physiological response. It can literally lead to an amygdala hijack.
Wait, a hijack?
Yeah. The brain perceives the potential for social rejection as an actual physical threat. So it floods your system with cortisol, the stress hormone. And here is the kicker. This stress response actively suppresses the prefrontal cortex, which is the exact part of your brain responsible for complex cognitive behavior and memory retrieval.
Oh, wow. Which completely explains why you can study a language for years, you can know all the vocabulary on paper, but the second someone asks you a simple question in a coffee shop, your mind just goes entirely blank.
Yes.
The retrieval pathway is literally chemically blocked by stress.
Precisely. You haven't forgotten the words. You are biologically locked out of accessing them. So what is Leo actually doing with the mirror trick?
He's removing the threat.
Exactly. He is creating a low-stakes sandbox. By removing the other human being from the equation, he completely removes the threat of social judgment. The amygdala stays calm. The prefrontal cortex stays online.
So it's a way of isolating the variables of speaking.
Yes, because speaking a new language isn't just a mental exercise. We often forget it's a profound physical one, too.
How do you mean?
Well, you're asking the muscles in your tongue, your lips, and your vocal cords to move in entirely novel ways, to find new rhythms and cadences that they've never done before. Think about it like learning to type on a completely different keyboard layout, like, say, switching from a standard QWERTY keyboard to a Dvorak one.
Oh, that sounds like a nightmare.
Right. At first, you have to look at your fingers for every single letter. Every keystroke requires conscious, agonizing effort. Now, imagine if someone is standing right over your shoulder, staring at a stopwatch while you do this.
Oh, I would freeze immediately. I'd make 100 typos.
Exactly. But if you practice alone, in a quiet room, day after day, until your fingers just naturally know where the keys are, the physical mechanics become automatic.
Okay, I get it now. So the mirror trick allows the learner to build the actual physical muscle memory of speech without carrying the massive cognitive load of social anxiety at the same time.
You nailed it. Once those physical pathways are established in the mouth and throat, speaking requires way less conscious effort. Then, when Leo eventually graduated to joining an English club to practice with real people, he only had to manage the social anxiety variable.
Because the physical mechanics were already mostly on autopilot.
Exactly.
That makes the mirror trick seem much less silly and much more like a completely necessary biological workaround. It's brilliant. Okay, so let's say you are bravely speaking. You've survived the mirror, you're immersing yourself with your phone settings and the movies. How do you refine the structural integrity of the language?
You mean grammar?
Yes, grammar. Because Jetro is still sitting there staring at a book that presumably has entire chapters dedicated to conjugations and prepositions.
Yeah.
How do you learn grammar without falling right back into the boring textbook trap.
Well, Leo's advice here relies on implicit rather than explicit learning.
Reading what?
He tells Jetro to just start reading simple things, children's storybooks, short online news articles, and his stated purpose is that reading helps you understand grammar naturally without ever sitting down and studying the rules.
Which flies completely in the face of how we are all taught in school. I mean, we are taught to diagram sentences and memorize the formulas for subject-verb agreement. It's like trying to memorize complex architectural blueprints to understand how a house works.
Right, but Leo is saying just look at a bunch of solid, well-built houses.
Just walk through the house.
Exactly. Ask yourself this. When you speak your native language, are you consciously thinking about the rules of, say, a dangling participle or the correct order of cumulative adjectives?
Definitely not. I wouldn't even know how to explain those rules if I tried. But I instantly know when a sentence sounds wrong.
Exactly. If I say to you, I bought a red big dog, it sounds completely wrong to a native speaker.
Yeah, it should be a big red dog.
Right. The rule dictates that size comes before color. But nobody ever sat you down as a toddler and made you memorize that rule on a chalkboard. You learned it through statistical pattern recognition.
Pattern recognition.
The human brain is, at its core, a predictive processing engine. It constantly consumes data from the environment and tries to predict what comes next.
So by reading a massive volume of very simple children's books, Leo is just feeding his brain's predictive engine with a massive data set of correctly structured sentences.
Yes, children's books are perfect because the vocabulary is simple, meaning your cognitive load isn't wasted on trying to translate complex, obscure words.
Right, you aren't pausing to check your notebook every sentence.
Exactly. The brain can focus entirely on absorbing the structural patterns. You read enough simple sentences where the subject precedes the verb in a certain way, and your brain simply internalizes that pattern.
So the grammar becomes an intuition rather than a mathematical formula you have to compute before opening your mouth.
Exactly. It becomes second nature.
And you know, that distinction between an intuition and a formula, that leads directly into what is arguably the most profound moment in this entire coffee shop scene. After walking through all these practical habits, Leo shares his core underlying philosophy with Jetro.
This is the best part.
It really is. He says, think of English as a tool to communicate, not just a school subject to pass. And he promises that if Jetro enjoys using the tool, he will improve incredibly fast. And well, it works. The scene ends with Jetro feeling so motivated that they immediately agree to only speak English for the rest of their coffee break.
Right then and there. And the reason that works, the reason Jetro can instantly pivot from being paralyzed by a textbook to bravely speaking in a public space, is because Leo offered him a massive paradigm shift. He moved Jetro from a deficit model to a utility model.
Okay, let's break those models down. The deficit model is the school subject mindset.
Right. When a language is treated as a school subject, you basically start at a theoretical 100%. And every mistake you make is a deduction.
A penalty.
Yes, a mispronounced word is a red mark. A grammatical error is a lower grade. In a deficit model, the primary goal is simply the avoidance of failure. It breeds immense anxiety and perfectionism.
Because the mistake is tied directly to a judgment of your worth or your intelligence or your final grade.
Exactly. But when you reframe the language as a tool to communicate, the orientation completely flips. The original transcript's analogy of a tool is perfect here. Think about using a physical tool, like a hammer.
Okay, a hammer.
If you are trying to drive a nail into a piece of wood and you swing the hammer and hit the wood instead of the nail, you don't fail hammering class. The hammer doesn't judge you.
You just look at the dent in the wood, realize your angle was slightly off, and you try again.
Yes. The goal is not a perfect, theoretically flawless swing. The goal is driving the nail. The goal is utility. In language, the goal is connection. If you use messy grammar and the wrong vocabulary word, but the person sitting across from you smiles and hands you the cup of coffee you were trying to order,
The tool worked.
the tool worked perfectly.
The communication happened.
Exactly. The success condition isn't grammatical perfection, it is mutual understanding. Once Jetro realizes that his mistakes aren't failing grades, but just slight adjustments to his grip on the tool, the fear dissipates.
It fundamentally changes his relationship with failure. So what does this all mean for you listening? To pull all these threads together from Leo's masterclass to Jetro, mastering a language isn't about the heavy lifting of weekly cram sessions that your brain will just aggressively prune away anyway. It's about designing your environment for low-friction daily consistency. It's inducing that mild panic by changing your phone settings. It's anchoring new vocabulary to emotional narrative beats in movies instead of isolated lists.
Absolutely.
It's using the mirror as a social sandbox to build physical muscle memory without triggering an amygdala hijack. And it's feeding your brain's predictive engine with simple, repetitive structures. So grammar becomes an intuition, not a rule book.
And tying all of those amazing habits together is that foundational shift in identity, moving from the perfectionist student trying to pass a test to the pragmatic user of a tool.
Which leaves us with a really fascinating thought to walk away with today. Leo taught Jethro how to escape the textbook rut by reframing language as a tool rather than a test.
Right.
But if we take a step back, how much of our lives are currently governed by that same paralyzing deficit model?
Oh, a huge amount. Think about it. If we applied Leo's brilliant reframing to other complex, intimidating areas of our lives, whether that's trying to learn how to code, mastering public speaking, or even just sitting down to finally understand our personal finances,
Yeah, that's a big one.
right. How might treating all of those endeavors as practical, non-judgmental tools to be used rather than tests? We are terrified of failing fundamentally and permanently change our trajectory. Imagine what you could actually build if you finally put down the red pen, picked up the tool, and just allowed yourself to adjust your grip.
That is such a powerful perspective. Imagine what we could build. Thank you for joining us on this deep dive. Keep questioning the defaults, keep experimenting, and we will catch you next time.